This is the Contreras Report. Welcome. I am Raul Lowry Contreras. Let's talk about American politics, specifically about the fastest growing segment of politics and voting in the United States of America. The first thing a Hispanic writer or journalist discovers is that non-Hispanic white writers and journalists have no clue about Hispanics. The second thing one learns is that black journalists and writers are even worse. Every presidential election, analysis of the Hispanic vote for president is looked at by people who have no clue about how to analyze the Hispanic vote to begin with because they know so little about the people they are writing about. First, let's take a careful look at the Hispanic community. You can also call it the Latino community. What you can't call it is the LatinX community. 6 out of 10 Hispanics prefer to be called Hispanic or Latino. Between 2 to 4% prefer the newly invented word Latinx. The creators of the word are mostly gay women and some PhD holders of Chicano studies, because the word Chicano itself has flunked the test of time. Cubans refuse to accept anything but Cuban or Hispanic. Same with Puerto Ricans, but mostly Mexican Americans. The 2020 census has these numbers. There are 62.1 million Hispanics in the United States. That's 19% of the U.S. population. 1 in 5 Americans. That's 1 in 5 Americans. The 2020 number is 11 more than the 2010 census counted. The top 3 Hispanic states are California with 15.6 million Hispanics, 39% of the state. Texas with 11.4 million, 39% of Texas, and Florida with 5.7 million, which is 26% of the state of Florida. For the English-only crowd, there is this info from the census. Considering a healthy percentage of foreign-born Hispanics, there are 72% of all Hispanics say they speak English well. In 2000, 59% claimed to speak English well, so there has been some significant improvement there. Among native-born Hispanics, 91% say they speak English well. 57% say they speak Spanish at home. A drop from the 2020s, or the 2010s, 67%. For the education crowd, 42% of Hispanics over the age of 25 have college, some college, in 2019 compared to 36% in 2010. Again, another significant improvement. Like all other groups in the U.S., a gender gap exists between men and women in college. Women have increased from 38% in 2010 to 45% in 2019. Men were 33% in 2010 with an increase in 2019 to 39%. Degrees have increased from 2010's 13% to 18%. Now, I remember it wasn't that long ago, say 30 years ago, when we were talking 4 to 5%. So there's been significant improvement. In 2010, there were 2.9 million Hispanics, Latinos in college. In 2020, 3.6 million. Of the entire college population in 2010, Hispanics were 14% of the total. In 2019, 19%. Again, significant increase. For those who believe Hispanics don't attend school or college, that's 1 in 5 college students are today Hispanics, a group larger than non-Hispanic whites and of Black Americans. Hispanics are second in college matriculation today, second only to Asians. Now, who are they? No surprise here, except for the journalists and writers who know so little about Hispanics that they give Cubans and Puerto Ricans and other Central and South American Hispanics far more attention than their numbers warrant. Understand this. Mexican origin people are not only the largest Hispanic group, they are by a million miles. The 2020 census reports that of the 62.1 million Hispanics, 61.5% are of Mexican origin. That is 37.5 million people. They also live in all 50 states and territories. That is not the case with the other national Hispanic groups. Puerto Ricans, including 3 million in Puerto Rico, are 9.7% of the 62.1 million Hispanics. Cubans, 3.9%. Salvadorans, 3.9%. Dominican, 3.3%. And Guatemalans, 2.7%. All other identifiable nationalities, like Colombians, are less than 2% each. The final 2020 census number that is important is that 4 in 5 Hispanics are U.S. citizens, mostly U.S. born. Hispanics are better educated than ever, more numerous than ever, and are America's youngest group. 30 years of age is the median age of the 62.1 million Hispanics, with the median age of 26 for the 37 million plus Mexican origin people. Hispanics speak English well in larger numbers than ever. For Pentagon watchers, 1 in 5 United States Marines, those in the combat arms, that is, people who shoot at people with rifles, pistols, and machine guns, 1 in 5 U.S. Marines are of Mexican origin. When I was in the Marine Corps in the late 50s and early 60s, that figure was probably 3, 4, 5%. So how did they vote in 2020, the Hispanics? Did they rush to vote for Donald Trump, as some conservatives believe, or not? The media screams that Trump did very well with Hispanics, setting records with votes for Trump. Wrong. Wrong. First, except for Florida, where Cubans outnumber most other Hispanics and have a unique political background, it doesn't matter how Puerto Ricans vote, or even Cubans outside of Florida. Susan Crabtree, a writer for Real Clear Politics, wrote, quote, Trump won 38% of the Hispanic vote in 2020, a 10 percentage point increase from 2016, and far better than John McCain and Mitt Romney, the previous 2 GOP nominees for president. Is that true? The Cato Institute, very respected institute, says Trump garnered 32 to 35% of the 2020 exit polls, not 38%. The McCain-Romney numbers shouldn't even be mentioned, as those elections ended an 8-year GOP reign in the White House, as Trump ended an 8-year-long Democrat White House. Since Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the only time a White House hasn't changed party hands after 8 years was in 1988, when Americans, in their wisdom, continued the Reagan-Bush years another 4 years with George Herbert Walker Bush, whose victory extended the Republican hold on the White House for 4 more years, for a total of 12. Another mistake by Crabtree and most other people who parrot her numbers is that the 2020 election had the smallest percentage of Election Day voters ever because of early voting and mail ballots. Facts are that far more Americans voted early, like me, in person than ever. 100 million people voted early voting. Fewer than 50 million people voted on Election Day, and everyone agrees that those people heavily voted Republican. Thus, the 38% figure that Crabtree refers to. Moreover, a huge cohort voluntarily voted by mail. In some states, people could only vote by mail, so there were no exit polls. Savvy? Thus, Election Day exit polls don't reflect anywhere near the American vote for president as a whole. But the 2 states where Trump won, Florida and Texas, both with substantial Hispanic votes, there the Hispanic vote not only was predictable, in Texas the results were Trump did very well. But they're false positives. Here's why. Florida is a special case. It is populated by many refugees from Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, and their families. They have opposition to communist socialist dictatorships the 3 countries have in common. Those that have been naturalized have traditionally voted heavily Republican. The 2020 election broke the Obama hold on Florida by returning to its longtime Republican voting behavior. Trump lost Florida in 2016, but came back with a heavier Cuban, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan vote in 2020. 38% of the Hispanic vote? Maybe. Texas, on the other hand, is totally different from Florida. For one thing, the Hispanic population in Texas is almost exclusively of Mexican origin, not as a polyglot mixture of different national groups with very, very few of mixed blood with the massive Indian population that causes mixed blood in Mexico. One will remember the famous appellation applied in Florida to a Cuban defendant in a nationally watched murder trial of an alleged, quote, white Hispanic, unquote, defendant. The media came up with that. In Texas, they are called illegal Mexican aliens, even if they are legally in the United States. The entire Cuban American population nationally is 3.9% of Hispanics. Texas is 39% Mexican origin, just like California, although only 11 million. In other words, the Tex-Mex is a totally different person than Florida's Cubans, Central Americans, and South Americans. Susan Crabtree wrote, quote, Trump increased his margin of victory by a whopping 19 to 55 points in 10 heavily Mexican-American counties along the border. Big deal, Crabtree. Republican U.S. Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison, a favorite of mine, carried the same area, to win a U.S. Senate seat in 1993 with 67% of the vote. Besides, Crabtree forgot to mention that Texas has 258 counties. Most have tiny, tiny populations. Those border counties Trump carried are all rural, small counties that grow things like welfare checks or cattle. As a matter of fact, nationally, Hispanics, well, Mexican Americans, are 95% urban dwellers. Only 5% live in counties like those in Texas that Trump carried. Those counties have little industry, just dirt. 500 votes is a lot, percentage-wise. If we weren't talking about a presidential election, those border counties voting Republican might be news, but their votes total hardly anything and were counterbalanced by Bejar County, San Antonio voting. Overwhelmingly, San Antonio voted overwhelmingly for Biden. Historically, Trump's Hispanic vote hardly measures up to George W. Bush's 50% of the Hispanic vote in Texas that re-elected him governor in 1998. Or the 40 to 44% he received in his 2004 re-election nationally. The political question is, did Hispanics who voted for Donald Trump project more Hispanic support for the GOP in the future? Or is a historical revisit to the golden days in California when Hispanics generally voted for Republican governors and legislatures almost every election from 1900 until 1958? Only one Democrat was elected governor in California during that 58-year period. He was elected in 1938 and beaten in 1942 by a name you may recall, Earl Warren. Hispanics traditionally have split their votes 50-50 in California and even voted in good numbers for Pete Wilson in 1990, making him the last elected Republican governor since, with the exception of Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was elected during a recall election. The tipping point that started the outflow of Hispanics from a tradition of voting for Republicans in California came when Governor Pete Wilson, who always had Hispanic support when he was a 3-term mayor of San Diego, financed Proposition 187's placement on the 1994 ballot. Proposition 187 was the last gasp of California white people, said California State Democratic Chairman Senator Art Torres. He was right. Other than Arnold, no Republican has been elected statewide since 1994. Listening to all this has been national columnist Ruben Navarrete of the Washington Post Writers Group. His twice-a-week columns appear in over 100 newspapers. He has worked at the Arizona Republic in Phoenix, the Dallas Morning News in Texas, the San Diego Union, and wrote for CNN previously. Currently, he also writes for the Daily Beast. Ruben, am I wrong in this definition of the Hispanic community and its 2020 voting?
Raul, so good to be with you again. Thank you. I've got a few minutes to spare with you to talk. I've got a heart out at the bottom of the hour, but I will tell you, I listened to what you had to say. I think that we are a very complicated community of people of 62 million. I find fascinating that not just white folks and black folks don't understand Latinos, but we ourselves as Latinos don't understand ourselves. We don't have a sense for our complexity, for our contradictions, for what we're doing wrong. And we are doing a lot of things wrong. I think that the story a few generations ago, 50 or 60 years ago, was Latinos would get further if the white man wasn't holding us down, wasn't actively discriminating against us in overt ways, keeping us out of colleges, keeping us down in the military, keeping us down in business, all across the board. And now it's a different story. Now, 50 years later, the story is, what are we doing to ourselves in terms of holding ourselves down? That is really the interesting thing, I think, about everything you talked about. You talked about it on a national level, on a state level. And the major point is that we are an incredibly important, large, growing part of the American story. And we've gone from being sort of this minority group, as we used to call ourselves, to being now part of the mainstream. So now we're defining the mainstream. It's a whole paradigm shift in the last 50 years. But as you were talking, I made some notes very quickly of 10 little things that we do not do well as Latinos. And this is true specifically of Mexican and Mexican Americans, who, as you point out, represent 60% of the entire 62 million. The lion's share, all the other groups, the Dominicans, the Colombians, the Venezuelans, are all 2-3%. I get that. The Cubans, 2-3%. So it's mostly about Mexicans, but also about Latinos in general. We do not challenge the boss at work. We do not know our own worth. We do not tell our story well. We don't brag on our accomplishments. We don't support each other. We don't shop the political parties and split our vote between Republican and Democrat. We don't tolerate different points of view. We don't unite within the groups. We don't defend immigrants and refugees as much as we should, unless there are Republicans in the White House, but certainly not when a Democrat's the bad guy. And lastly, we don't take responsibility for our choices and actions. So I think the new narrative, Raul, has to be not what white people are doing to hurt us, but what we are doing to hurt ourselves. And that's the conversation Latinos never have. We never talk about that. We never want to talk about what we're doing wrong. It's always somebody else. It's somebody else. You know, I'd have been president if not for the white guy who held me down. No. ¿Sabes qué? ¿Sabes qué? No. Fíjate que no. That is not true. We are doing many things wrong. We are our own worst enemy. And that's what I took away from listening to you.
Well, that's interesting. In fact, I agree with you almost entirely with what you just said.
Why? You said interesting. You know why I took it away? Because the tone of it was like, we're this big, so good, so percent. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that we have a buying power of $2.7 trillion a year. It doesn't matter that we're 62 million and 18% of the population. We have not translated that into power. And that's the part, when I was listening to you, it's always sort of, during Hispanic Heritage Month, I've heard this so many times, we're going to take over, and it never happens. And the reason it doesn't happen is because instead of saying the white people are holding us down, we need to look in the mirror and think about what we've been doing wrong these many years.
And I agree with all that, but what I do is, you say we don't brag about ourselves, and that's what I do. In other words, when college matriculation passed the non-Hispanic white, according to the Pew Research polls, I jumped up and down for joy, because that smashes the white man's version of Mexicans don't go to college. They don't want to learn. The Victor Davis Hanson routine. And that's not true, and we can prove it. So the first thing we have to do is show what we are doing. And a few weeks ago, when the bombing occurred outside the airport at Kabul in Afghanistan, and 11 U.S. Marines were killed by a suicide bomber, and it turns out that 5 of them were of Mexican-American origin. I think one was Puerto Rican. In any event, 5 of the 11 were Hispanic. Now that's amazing. That's more than 1 in 5 that I suggest in this essay. 1 in 5 Marines are Hispanic, because 5 out of 11 is over 50%. And I made a big deal about that. In other words, I'm saying, hey, we're not only part of the fabric, we're a major part of the fabric.
And my point is,
people jumped all over me about it.
You are one person of 62 million. It is fair to say that Raul Lowry Contreras and Ruben Navarrete have enormous egos. Okay? We love ourselves. We love the sound of our own voice. But I'm talking about 62 million Latinos who are not named Navarrete and Contreras. And there are many of us who do not brag about our accomplishments. And I'll tell you why. Because I have a business, consulting business because of this. I help CEOs who are Latino of nonprofits and startups tell their story. And I have been struck by the fact that you can be a very accomplished Latino with 5 degrees from Harvard or Yale and not be comfortable talking about yourself or bragging about yourself. And I finally realized why that is. Because when we were little, okay, back when we were little chiquitos, we had a tía or a comadre who said, mira ese que se cree mucho. Mira, Ruben, que se fue a Harvard y now se quiere mucho. You know, why didn't he go to state college? That's where Mijo went. But Ruben, he had to go to Harvard. Se cree mucho. So in the back of my mind, I have the tía telling me, don't brag. You know, because you don't want to seem too full of yourself. The problem is that America rewards people who are full of themselves. They elected Donald Trump, who is full of himself. You will never get anywhere in this country if you do not learn how to tell your story and brag on your accomplishments. And we don't do that well. I'm sorry. We are humility. We're all about, if they had a humility Olympics, Latinos and Mexicans would show up and win all the medals because we're good at that. We're muy bien at them. Toda madre. We do that well. But in terms of bragging, the white man typically brags. You know this. I'm telling you something you know. There are people who have not accomplished 10% of what I've accomplished in my life. But because they're white men, they walk around like, you know, it's a whole different cosa. I mean, they have a very healthy self-image, but we as Latinos do not.
I agree. And as you know, I have a member of my family that graduated from Harvard just 2 or 3 years ago. And she's the first in our family to go to a private college. The rest of us have gone to either Cal State University or the University of California. And we're all proud of that, especially me. I was the first one. But then along comes my niece and she chooses Harvard, you know. So the point is that going back many years when I first got involved in politics, and I used to go to Republican meetings and push hard to go after the Mexican vote. Let's do this, let's do that. Let's support this guy, let's not support that guy. And people would say to me, you've got a chip on your shoulder. They would accuse, even though I was being positive of trying to grow the Republican Party 50 years ago, I had a chip on my shoulder to the people that didn't like Mexicans. And so you and I have faced that problem all of our lives. I brag about you going to Harvard, you know, because
what I'm saying
you're the first farm boy I ever knew that went there.
Exactly. It's either insecurity or it's whatever. But the fact is, I routinely run across white men who have a tremendous ego that makes me look like I'm humble. And I am struck by the fact that in many cases, they are not as qualified as me. They're not as intelligent as me. They don't have the things that I've done, but they have a tremendous amount of self-confidence. And I don't think that Latinos, because of what we've been through, have that self-confidence. So it's one of the things that I say. But anyway, listen, I've got to run off. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for the segment.
Well, thank you, Ruben, and we'll talk to you again. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being there, and we much appreciate your being there. If you'd like to subscribe to this channel, you do so because we'll notify you whenever we post a new Contreras report. As you know, we're branching out now and bringing in more people, and in so doing, we're broadening the scope of information that we talk about. And that's what this is all about, is information. Informing you, you informing me, events informing both of us, but you need them seen through these eyes because, like Ruben and I, we have a different perspective. Now we're jumping on our own people because our own people aren't standing up for themselves. And I'm talking about their accomplishments. I'll talk about them. Thank you for being there. This is Raul Lowry Contreras. This is the Contreras Report. We'll see you next time.